This Sunday, COVID fallout, vaccination frustration.
Refresh.
Hearing more about the first dose, particularly for folks that have had COVID. Any of these new studies giving you any sense of where we would change our vaccine distribution schedule? Make it where we're 12 weeks for everybody or 6 weeks for everybody. What of these studies is giving you any sense of whether we should change these protocols?
Well, Chuck, I think that people need to appreciate the view is there really two very different scenarios that you just painted. One is if you've been infected and you get vaccinated after that, what about one dose? The other is if you've not been infected and you get one dose of Pfizer, can you get away with one dose or prolong the second dose? And I will still maintain that there are enough unknowns in that, particularly the durability of the protection. We know from studies that we did that antedated and led up to the very, very impressive results with the 94 to 95% efficacy with both Moderna and Pfizer, that when you give a boost, you increase the power or the level of the antibodies by at least tenfold. So you're talking about a very, very big increase. We don't know what the durability of a single dose is, and it really is risky for lack of protection and risky to engender perhaps some variants. With regard to following infection, that's a different story because the data look really quite impressive that if you've been infected and then you get a single dose, the boost that you get with that single dose is really enormous. So we're looking very carefully about that. And that is one thing that you might want to consider, but we want to really carefully look at the data first. But those are two different scenarios. You don't want to confuse them.
And I was just going to say, so let's say you see this science and you feel good about this, about if you've had COVID, one dose may be enough. I'm just curious, logistically, what would that mean? Would you have somebody would have to come in and show proof they've had COVID? Is that something, or they would be tested there for antibodies? I feel like that's the one gap here that would complicate it just logistically.
Right. Well, that's the reason why I held back, Chuck, in saying, yes, let's recommend that. You've really got to look at the science, look at the data, and figure out what's the best way. The obvious one that you think of is the documentation that if you do an antibody test and it's very clear that this person has been infected, that then you could be reasonably comfortable that you're dealing with someone who is post-infection. But I would reserve any kind of decisions about that until we very carefully looked at the data. But it is really quite suggestive. The data were really impressive.
So this is something you think could be something that in 4, 6, 8 weeks, something like that, we could change protocol?
Well, you know, again, I don't want to get ahead of the decision-making process on TV, but I think it's quite reasonable from the data that we've seen that you want to take a good look at it because the data are impressive.
I want to ask you about pregnant women.
Now let's get to it, right into it. You got to see through it. Go back, rewind, listen, and pay attention to the propaganda, you know, and the commercializing of this vaccine. Man trying to sell it to y'all, you know what I mean? To me as well, you know, because I'm like, get caught up into it, like, oh, I gotta snap out of it. Man, I forgot this is a salesman. This man been in the game since the beginning of time when it comes to selling goddamn drugs. That man been around selling when it was HIV vaccines, any type of thing you gotta understand. Check out the patents, you know what I'm saying? Because if there's a patent on any type of so-called virus, you have to understand that means someone has to own it, because you cannot put a patent on anything that's tied to nature. So if it's a patent onto it, that means that somebody owns it, somebody had to create it. So that means it's not natural. So if there's patents on so-called viruses, SARS and so forth, the Ebola, you know what I'm saying? Like, there are patents. Look that up, and you will see that the people have patents on it, meaning that somebody had to create it. That's just a fact, whether you want to agree or not. And then this is a man that's been, him and the Bill Gates Foundation, whatnot, Melinda, all them, they've been in Africa slaughtering people for the longest, hitting them with vaccines. Next thing you know, AIDS went up like crazy. Now you're trying to tell me, because here it is, I can even go support and speak up for the white community as well. When it comes to growing up, there was a older white, you know what I'm saying, he was, you know what I'm saying, gay. You know what I'm saying? He was a homosexual. You know what I'm saying? Not to be disrespectful. You know what I'm saying? He was a good friend of the family. You know, you know what I'm saying, associated and played with his adopted children, you know what I'm saying, coming up. But we knew how he was. But him and a few others we knew died. Do you understand? They died from the AIDS virus. So you're telling me, you know what I'm saying, I have family members who, you know what I'm saying, caught that disease or whatnot. You know what I'm saying? You have some that's still living with HIV and all this. You're telling me that it's all behind the protection. That's what they're talking about with this mask. So you're saying, you see how they're emphasizing and switching, pay attention to the language. It's just how they did with the mask. It went from recommendation to mandatory. Are you seeing what I'm saying? They went from recommending us wear the mask to mandatory. So that's the same thing they're doing with this vaccine. They're going to try to go from recommending it to making it mandatory, where you can't show up on no federal grounds or state grounds without showing proof. So you can't even come to them and say, "Oh, I already had the virus. Leave me alone." You can't even hit them with that, even though you might be telling the truth. They're going to need you to show proof. Meaning, even if you did have it, now you got to go catch it again to prove them and without taking a shot. You see what I mean? So otherwise, you're going to have to take the shot. This is what they're doing. Watch the language. Pay attention to the language. They're going to usher in the mandatory of it. Meaning, you know what I'm saying, to get your license, to, you know the whole thing, the whole rundown, to get food stamps, to get your stimulus, to so forth, to get on an airplane, get on a bus, to travel, to go out of state, to, you know what I'm saying, like, you're going to have to prove, to be on the work site. It's going to be a time where they're trying to make it mandatory. So with that being said, pay attention to the language and understand the malarkey of it all. Because if you have it where you're that concerned about protecting people, where were you when so many were dying from a virus? All these other previous viruses, you know? Because at the end of the day, that's what it adds up to. Protecting the people, you're saying, and controlling the virus. Where were you with this idea when people were dying and still are dying from these other sexual viruses? So my point, you're using protection, so-called equipment, to be mandatory on people. That's what you're pushing for. So that means, are you going to make it mandatory for people to wear condoms? Think.